Until April 1986, Chernobyl was just a little-known Ukraine town deep within the Soviet Union. It was also a major nuclear power plant, feeding massive amounts of electricity into the grid. In reactor number 4, engineers began a test soon after 1 in the morning of the 26th. Designed as a safety measure, the test created a disaster. The nuclear worst-case scenario was a reality: meltdown. The reactor overheated, exploded, and burned furiously. Many workers died, several suffering cruel, drawn-out deaths.
И общая боль, она нас объединила, заставила сделаться более сильными, выстаивать против того, что нам приходится переживать, быть гордыми, даже в таких вот трудных условиях. Было 250 человек, получили острую лучевую болезнь 26 апреля. На сегодняшний день в Украине в живых осталось 172 человека.
Fire services were soon on the scene, although with little understanding of what they were dealing with. For 10 days, the core of the reactor continued to burn, and Russian helicopters dropped sand to stop the fire, boride to stop the nuclear chain reaction, and lead to block radiation. In all, 5,000 tons of material. Up to 1 million soldiers, firemen, and volunteers worked on the cleanup. The explosion had spread material throughout the site, and the ground was heavily contaminated. Workers shoveled radioactive soil and picked up debris with little personal protection and even less awareness of the dangers.
The problem basically is how much radioactive contamination there is on the site and in the immediate vicinity of the site. And this is something which really we just do not know in any detail at the present moment.
The government had hoped to keep the disaster quiet, but after 24 hours there'd already been radiation deaths and several people were seriously ill. They decided to evacuate the nearby town of Pripyat. Citizens were told to pack just enough for a few days and sent to Kiev for assessment. As yet, the scale of radiation sickness was not known, but the cases were on the rise and it had become an international issue. The high radiation levels were detected in Sweden. The truth began to emerge. The radioactive clouds had impacted not just on the immediate Ukraine area, but had drifted with the winds. Russia was badly affected, as was Belarus, where 60% of the fallout landed. Much of the Northern Hemisphere was affected, even as far as England and the United States. Long-range effects in every sense.
A good estimate, a fair estimate, would be 700 people would die from radiation exposures received as a result of the Chernobyl fallout in the UK.
Chernobyl would prove to be the biggest industrial disaster ever, and it's not over yet. Since early in the 20th century, scientists worldwide had pursued nuclear energy. Undeterred by Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they pressed on after the war, and in the 1950s, nuclear-powered electricity generation became a reality. Leading the field were America and Russia, both of whom established early commercial power generation facilities. Russia was first in 1954, followed by England and America. Over the following decades, several countries around the world established their own nuclear power plants, making this a significant component of global energy. Russia had, however, become increasingly isolationist and unfriendly. In the Cold War, it rapidly expanded its nuclear capacity, including weapons, behind an impenetrable curtain of secrecy. Chernobyl was very much a part of this. The plant had been operational since 1977, its number 4 reactor only a few years old. Engineers were concerned that in the event of an emergency shutdown of this reactor, there would be a delay of a minute before generators could power the cooling systems critical for safe operation. A test was planned to shut down the reactor and see if the mechanical power of the still rotating turbine could provide enough energy until the generators took over. The test was originally scheduled for the day of the 25th, but due to power demand was delayed until soon after midnight. This was the off-peak period, manned by less experienced night shift staff. During preparations for the test, an operational error forced a premature shutdown. The system was restored, but now the delicate chemical and atomic balance was affected. At 1:23 a.m., the test began. The reactor quickly overheated, the steam causing it to produce more power and in turn more heat in an endless cycle. Within a minute, a massive steam explosion blew the 2,000-ton lid off the reactor, followed quickly by an explosion within the core. A nuclear reaction more powerful than the combined Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Exploded parts of the reactor were hurled upwards and out, landing on the roof and scattering nuclear fuel rods and contaminated debris on the ground outside. The graphite core ignited, dispersing thick clouds of radioactive material into the atmosphere. These would travel far, eventually coming to ground as vapor or in raindrops. Just 2 kilometers from the Chernobyl plant, the town of Pripyat was built to house the workers and families. By 1986, it was home to 50,000 people, with many young children. In the hours after the explosion, people were out in force, enjoying the beautiful sunny Saturday, unaware of the danger until the government belatedly acted. At 2 on Sunday afternoon, 1,100 buses ferried the township's people to Kiev. Told it was just for a few days, residents left nearly all their belongings, never to return. A 30-kilometer no-go zone was declared, and the houses sat empty and abandoned. Left behind, pets became crazed with hunger, and the army was sent in to destroy them. 2 days after the accident, the outside world still had not been told. Only after pressure from Sweden did authorities release a terse statement on the Monday night. Too little, too late. The town's residents and many other people had already been exposed to high levels of radiation. What effect that would have would not be known for years, even generations. The explosion and the fire in the plant had been horrific, but this was only the beginning. In the immediate aftermath, there was a high risk of another explosion, and the fire still raged. Hundreds of thousands of people worked tirelessly. Specialists like physicists and medicos, emergency workers, miners, and soldiers. Initially, few knew of the personal dangers and had virtually no protection from radiation. Many were exposed repeatedly to high doses. Liquidators worked right at the danger zone, some wearing protective suits, but still at great risk. They poured water down the reactor and pulled the injured and dead out. They tunneled under the burning core to drain off explosive fluids and pumped thousands of liters of radioactive water. Once the fire was finally out, the immediate priority was to contain the radioactive material. As much as possible was pushed down into the core, and then the task began of sealing off the reactor, still containing an estimated 97% of its radioactive material. Using the damaged building as a frame, a shelter was hastily constructed. Made of steel and concrete, the sarcophagus, as it became known, was expected to last only about 30 years and was not able to provide a perfect seal. Within months of the Chernobyl disaster, the government had instituted an inquiry into the causes of the accident. Its chief aim was to ascertain what lessons could be learned to hopefully prevent such an event happening again.
The lesson of Chernobyl will continue to remind us about the necessity of strict preventive approach to technology as a whole and to new technology in particular.
The investigation found that the test on the reactor had not been fully authorized, and that inexperienced operators had ignored important safety warnings and even turned off safety systems. Operational errors had seriously reduced the capacity to regulate power output through the use of control rods, and flaws in the reactor's design contributed to the accident.
What they did in this test was to divert the steam from the turbine which generates the power. They kept the generator connected up to the pump. Then, of course, the turbine began to freewheel and run down and eventually would have come to a standstill. And as it did that, the amount of electricity which it was generating also diminished. And so the pump would be slowing down at the same rate as the turbine was slowing down. This means that the amount of cooling water that the pump was circulating through the reactor gradually diminished. Eventually a stage was reached when insufficient water was being passed through the reactor to keep it cool. Well, I find it remarkable that they turned off the automatic systems. I should explain that these reactors have got safety systems which protect them in depth. 3 or 4 levels of safety systems. And the operators switched out 3 levels of safety provision before they started this experiment, or test. Indeed, they had to do that because otherwise they could never have performed the test. Those safety systems would have switched the reactor off, and they would have introduced emergency cooling water to cool the reactor down. And the operators, before they began the test, apparently, according to the report, inhibited both of those safety functions. And they also inhibited a third safety function, which has to do with this effect of xenon, which I mentioned a moment ago, and that's rather complicated to explain. Mm-hmm. So, it's really inconceivable, in my view, that in a properly regulated situation, properly controlled by safety inspectors, that the operators would ever be allowed to perform a test under those conditions. But they did. And the Russians have said that they were wrong to do it. I mean, they have identified the guilty men who have either run away, been sacked, or been sacked and also put in prison. Mm-hmm. So we are really looking at a situation here where the operators, poorly educated men apparently, not very well instructed in operating the reactor, really did behave like cowboys.
As a consequence of the 3 Mile Island accident, we would expect approximately 1 excess cancer death. If these same risk factors are applied to the Chernobyl data, we estimate between 2,500 and 25,000 excess cancer deaths in the European portion of the Soviet Union. The worldwide impact may be 1 to 2 times greater, as was the overall incidence of cancers.
The tragic legacy of Chernobyl is clearly visible in the newborn babies of Belarus, suffering a high number of deformities and handicaps.
Children's thyroid glands are very, very sensitive to radiation, whether it's external beam radiation or whether it's radioisotope exposure.
By 2005, 1,800 children in the Ukraine had developed thyroid cancer, normally rare in children. In 1990, the incidence of this cancer in Belarusian children was 30 times the pre-Chernobyl rate. Thousands more cases are anticipated in coming years.
I think the point that has come out with these patients is the wide variety of complications that they've experienced: lung damage, liver damage, kidney damage, as well as the other problems that I've mentioned. And I think this has been one of the major difficulties that they've encountered with the Chernobyl victims.
Two decades after Chernobyl, plant workers gathered to farewell another friend.
Ну, полностью изменилось. Вся жизнь разделилась на две части. До аварийной и после аварийной. После аварийной это жизнь на выживание. До этого было все прекрасно. Вот все, что я могу сказать.
These men are considered the lucky ones in that they are alive. Many of their contemporaries, particularly the liquidators, are dead. Of these, most died very young, several suicided. For Chernobyl's survivors, it's not necessarily easy.
Авария очень многое зачеркнула, изменила жизнь. То есть я не мог уже работать, например, по своей прямой специальности. После аварии я пытался войти в зону и приступить к своим обязанностям, на что руководство станции мне шло навстречу, но я не мог долго продержаться там. Я продержался всего лишь полгода и сказал, что нет, я это не могу. И моральное и психическое состояние не позволяло мне, ну и физическое тоже.
For those who were present at Chernobyl, things would never be the same again. They'd seen death and suffering. They knew about loss, grief, and the uncertainty of life. As the years have rolled by, Chernobyl has become just a memory for people far removed from the tragedy. For these people, it's a memory that refuses to go away and will stay forever. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the sensations.
Услышали сначала гул, это где-то 150 метров от реактора 4-го. Здание это азотно-кислородное. Через несколько секунд после гула прокатилась по плиточному полу такая волна, где-то около 30 сантиметров высотой, типа землетрясения. С правой стороны был виден уже первый взрыв на 4-м блоке. И через несколько секунд второй, но в виде такой белой, как фотовспышка шапки. Секунд 6 он продержался. Вот. Ну, мы продолжали работать. Продолжали работать до утра.
A defining aspect of Chernobyl was that in the face of nuclear devastation, an incredible calm and stoicism remained within the workers. Whether it was self-control, the work ethic, or ignorance of the dangers, they stood their ground.
Особенно не задумались, что это... Иначе бы, как говорится, если бы, наверное, задумались, наверное, разбежали все куда. Тем более, что знаю уже, что-то человек получил. Я говорю, что практически все люди, особенно весь оперативный персонал, кто мог работать, он весь работал, продолжал работать.
The real human cost of Chernobyl will never be known.
Невзирая на то, что после Чернобыльской аварии прошло 20 лет, я думаю, что последствия этой катастрофы будет ощущать Украина еще длительное время. Мне кажется, что и будущее поколение, дети постоянно будут находиться под риском возникновения грозных, в том числе и опухолевых заболеваний.
Chernobyl will continue to ooze radiation until its new billion-dollar sarcophagus is complete.
Since Chernobyl, I think the record of the nuclear industry on safety is extremely good, but I think we do recognise that the risk of a big accident is something that does concern many people, but lots of moves have been made over the time since Chernobyl worldwide to do things like peer reviews of reactors by staff of other companies that have really increased the security of the plants.
Oil uncertainty, dirty fuels and carbon taxes have swung attention back to nuclear energy. But Chernobyl remains a lesson with a key factor, the unpredictable element of human error.
There is an increased demand for energy. There is a concern about climate change. There is a competition for resources. Nuclear energy is a clean source of energy. Sure, there are certain reservations in some countries about nuclear power because, of course, it started with Chernobyl, and that still the legacy of Chernobyl made people very hyper about nuclear energy. But the key answer to that is that we have to continue to focus on safety, as some people mention, and to make sure that nuclear energy, is perceived by people to be safe.
Chernobyl's lessons have certainly resulted in improvements to nuclear safety. All plants must have suitable containment in the event of an accident, so that radiation cannot enter the atmosphere. And design issues from the Chernobyl reactors have been corrected in more modern installations. Nuclear waste, however, remains an issue.
Nuclear energy is reliable. It's the safest form of energy in existence, according to the records at the moment. For unfortunate reasons, the public will regard any accident in a nuclear power station as of great severity. If a workman drops a wrench on his toe, this gets headlines. If 500 die in a coal mine, it's on the back page. It's just a bit of nonsense that goes on. Perhaps understandable, but it goes on. I do not see renewable energy as offering very much at all, and I think without the huge subsidies, it would not even be considered commercially, except with, of course, established renewable energy like water power, which is already used to its limit.
It has made a comeback. I mean, now there are around 30 reactors under construction around the world, but beyond that, a lot of new countries are starting to show interest in nuclear power. Malaysia has recently said that it's very, very interested. Indonesia, Vietnam as well. Countries that formerly didn't show a great deal of interest, but also in the established nuclear countries.
An increasing number of countries see nuclear energy as an option in the face of diminishing fossil fuels. Some countries are also adopting other forms of renewable energy, such as wave and tidal power, biomass and geothermal.
China has now recently become a net oil importer. They have a domestic option in terms of coal, but they have very severe air pollution problems. So that nuclear is a very promising solution for them, and of course their growth is the economic story of the first half of 2004. If you're in North America, where there's still a lot of gas and coal, those tend to come out better in the economic calculation. In countries like South Korea and Japan that don't have indigenous fossil fuel resources and have to import everything, that tilts the calculation towards nuclear.
Chernobyl's legacy is death, disease, and deformity. It's also 20,000 years of contaminated land. If nuclear power is the way of the future, hopefully all nations and all people remember the lesson of Chernobyl. There's no room for complacency in this world. It's all we've got.